A number of YouTubers asked me to do more on basic stuff. And here is a very important person, George Ohm. I recommend that if you get some time to read his biography, it's very interesting. And what he came up with is now known as Ohm's law. And what he stated was V equals I times R, where V is volts, I is amps or amperes, and R is resistance. In today's world, the V has been changed to an E. E equals I times R is extremely useful, but sometimes we don't know what I is, and sometimes we may not know what R is either. So we can solve for I and we can solve for R. Starting on the left with the original equation, E equals I times R, if we divide both sides of that equation with R, the resistance, we end up with E over R equals I, or reversing that, I equals E over R. Likewise, starting all the way to the left again with E equals I times R, if we divide both sides by I, we end up with E over I equals R, or R equals E over I. So now we have three equations, and if we know two of any of the three, we can figure out what the third one is. And yes, this is the mule in the Little Rascals. Algebra. Here is the simplest circuit: a battery, a resistor, and I've got an ammeter. And we have E equals I times R. We know what R is, 1 ohm. And the current is 1 amp. And I'm using small letters there just to save room. And if we use E equals I times R, we end up with this. E equals 1 amp times 1 ohm equals 1 volt. Here is another simple circuit. This time we know the voltage, 20 volts, and the resistance is 10 ohms. So now we're going to use the second formula that we came up with, I equals E over R, and that yields this, I equals 20 volts divided by 10 ohms equals 2 amps. In this simple circuit, the voltage is 200 volts and the current is 0.25 amps, but we don't know what the resistance of the resistor is. So we can use the third formula we came up with, and that yields this. R equals 200 volts divided by 0.25 amps. So the resistance of that resistor is 800 ohms. Here is a little more complex circuit. The voltage is 500 volts. The current is 0.5 amps, but this time we have two resistors in series, an 800 ohm and a 200 ohm resistor. Using the top formula, E equals I times R, we can figure out the voltage drop across each of those resistors. And here are the results. E equals I times R. 0.5 times 800 ohms equals 400 volts. Then the other one, 0.5 times 200 ohms equals 100 volts. So we have 400 volts across that 800 ohm resistor, and we have 100 volts across the 200 ohm resistor. Here's the most complex circuit so far. We have 120 volts. We don't know what the current is, but we do have a 100 ohm resistor in series with 3 resistors in parallel. One of them is 55 ohms, then 35 ohms, then 95 ohms. And I would like to know what the current is in this circuit. I would also like to know what the voltage drop is across each resistor. And I would also like to know what the current is through each of the parallel resistors. I would first start in figuring out what the overall resistance is of those 3 parallel resistors. And in a previous video I went through how you do that, and here's the formula. We've got 1 over 55 plus 1 over 35 plus 1 over 95, and solving for this we end up with a total resistance of 17.54 ohms. And when you take a look at those 3 parallel resistors, that does make sense because the lowest of the 3 is 35, and then you've got 2 more resistors in parallel, so the resistance has got to be less than 35 ohms, and in this case it is 17.54 ohms. Now that we know what the overall resistance is of those 3 parallel resistors, I'm going to temporarily substitute that with 1 with the overall ohms. And if we add the 100 ohms to the 17.54 ohms, we end up with 117.54 ohms total. Now from this, we can use the second equation, I equals E over R, to figure out what the current is in this circuit. And that yields this, I equals 120 volts divided by 117.54 ohms. So the current in this circuit is 1.02 amps. Now that we know what the current is, we can now use the top formula, E equals I times R, to figure out what the voltage drops are across the 100 ohm resistor, which yields 102 volts, and of course across the 17.54 ohm resistor, that yields 17.84 0.89 volts, and I'm going to round that up to 18 volts. Now that we have all this information, the current in this circuit is 1.02 amps. The voltage drop across the 100 ohm resistor is 102 volts, and the voltage across the 3 parallel resistors is 18 volts. Using the second equation, I equals E over R, we can now figure the current through each of those resistors. In the 55 ohm resistor, we have 0.32 amps. Through the 35 ohm resistor, we have 0.51 amps. And through the 95 ohm resistor, we have 0.19 amps. For those of you that are just starting out in electronics, I hope this short demonstration helps you understand Ohm's law better, and also how important and useful it is.